Hello and welcome to Let's Talk Development, brought to you by Amila Africa Insights, which is a division of Amila Africa. In the second episode of the podcast, we explore Africa's energy and the future of it all, from the dark continent to where we're going, being right in the middle of the energy transition. We're joined by the Executive Chairman at the Africa Energy Chamber, NJ Ayuk, and we explore the different aspects of energizing our future. Enjoy. NJ, thank you so much for being with us today and welcome to Let's Talk Development. Maybe before we get into our conversation, keen to hear about you and the work that you do in the energy space.
Thanks for having me. I think, first of all, congratulations on doing this program. I think it's really important that we get focused on development really when we talk about Africa, because it's no longer acceptable where we are. And on that note, I actually got into this work with the African Energy Chamber because I think I was tired, like many Africans, where we see our continent with vast resources, but also underdeveloped. We see our continent with vast potential, but we cannot turn these prospects into real jobs, better conditions for everyday people, so the promises can come in there. So I was trained as a lawyer, and profession that most people don't like. But I felt in being a lawyer, you either have to decide whether you're going to be a social engineer or a social parasite, and you have to choose. So building a law firms, which I started in 2009, across the African continent with 17 law offices, and then got it listed into the stock exchange. But at the same time, still led the Energy Chamber. And I think the Energy Chamber has become the work of my life, really seeing that we, our generation at this time, we have a solemn obligation to really see how we can lift up our people, but also drive up business and ensure that growing capital in Africa by Africans is not a bad thing. We can embrace it and do both. So still got some energy to give, still got time to go and love my family, and it's really an honor to be doing this work.
Fantastic. I actually am glad you spoke about how well-resourced we are as a continent, NJ, because we're still called a dark continent. And it's, I think, a huge injustice of our time that is the reality. Are we this way because we can't get it right? We won't get it right? How did we get here?
Well, if you don't write your own history, and if you don't tell your own story, someone else is going to tell your story, and they're going to tell it the way they want. We should not be calling ourselves the dark continent. Those who call us dark continent, they should do that, and they will continue doing that. But also, we have to capture that and say, we're going to turn darkness into light. And how you turn darkness into light is we have to start looking within Africa, ourselves, and say, it's not about what they're doing to us, it's about what we're doing to ourselves. And that starts by us addressing that. You see, Mama always told me we need to look at the mirror all the time. But a lot of us in Africa today, whether in energy, we talk about intra-Africa trade, we just say, well, we just mirrored images. We just do it as we see it. No, you don't get up out of bed in the morning, your hair not done, you just walk around this thing, you're going to keep it real because that's the way it is. Mirrors are not to reflect what you see. Mirrors are to correct what you see. So we need to look at that mirror in Africa and say, what are we doing on taxes? What are we doing on transparency, corruption? What are we doing on governance issues? What are we doing on energy, beating the resource curse, the resource nationalism? What are we doing on crime? We look at that mirror and then we start correcting what we see.
With that said, let's talk about where we find ourselves today. It's 2024. We find ourselves right in the middle of what we're all calling an energy transition, but also with the reality that a lot of these minerals that are needed, these metals needed for this transition sit on this continent. And what we've seen from the first era of mining, NJ, is that all of this can be mined and nothing can happen for the African continent. And so we're definitely heading into a new, era where it's important for us to be able to meaningfully use our resources to energize our future and maybe even the globe. And I'm just wondering about the direction here? Where does the leadership come from? Just to make sure that we don't fumble the second round of mining on the continent.
We should not be talking about a transition, an energy transition, while dealing with an energy crisis. We have an energy crisis in Africa. So how do you transition? So you should be transitioning from that crisis. But when you have a crisis, you deal with a crisis first. 600 million Africans don't have access to electricity. 900 million have no access to clean cooking technologies, most of them women. We're cutting trees in order to cook and live our lives. Africa's most industrialized country, South Africa, is going 8 to 10 hours a day in the dark. When you have energy, you lose jobs, small businesses are closing, costs at the pump is high, cost for small business to run, it becomes too high, so the people lost jobs, people lost livelihood. Young boys and girls can't study because at 6 o'clock in the evening, it's dark. They have no shot to be competitive in education because without that, there's no future. But then we should be tackling that. So we need to be talking about how do we deal with Africa's energy growth, Africa's energy dominance, and across the continent. Of course, the transition is very important. Climate change and energy poverty, they're kind of two sides of the same coin. You have to deal with them both. But also, when you talk about a transition, you need to deal with a just energy transition. I wrote a book about it. A just transition. Why is that? Because if you look at wealthy nations, they have done more damage than Africa today. We are going from 2.75% greenhouse gas emission, the entire Africa. So what is there to decarbonize? What is there to take out? But also, we have to also set the parameters to say, it is called global warming, not Africa warming. So we need to start thinking about what role do we play as Africa to deal with the climate crisis and the energy crisis and energy transition. That's why we have to turn around what we do with mining. That's how we have to turn around what we do with gas. So I tell you this, what if we take some of the revenues coming out of mining or coming out of oil and natural gas today and say we're going to fast track investment into renewables. So we drive in solar, wind, and all of that across Africa. But what is most important, the wealthy nations have to live up to their bargain. You got to build that supply chain across Africa. So these Africans don't have to cross the Mediterranean looking for jobs in Europe. They can get jobs right here in this continent. But also, you need to look at the justice in it. And this mining resource curse that we're seeing, we have to ask those tough questions. So that's why I've told you in the past, we got to look at the mirror. We just finished mining in Daba, most very wealthy, big corporations. What have they done? We have to move past your corporate social responsibility projects. We got to move past that to really start dealing with what's your investments in those communities, in education, infrastructure, and really lifting people from bottom up.
The private sector doesn't innately exist for development. It's for shareholder value and to return, a value to those owners of of capital. So I'm keen to get your thoughts on that. Whose job then does it become, NJ, for us to ideologically steer the ship when it comes to energy? With governments, for instance, that are cash strapped, don't have the balance sheets to date to really fund energy transitions. So we find ourselves looking to the West for funding in different forms. But somebody has to ideologically get us going. Whose job is that?
I like how you become capitalist like me right now, saying private sector. You're right. I don't believe it's the private sector's job to raise that. But also you have to look at the wealthy nations. And I'll break it this way. African nations were promised $100 billion 13 years ago to sign on the climate challenge. They've never received a dime. So if you've not paid that money for right now, it'll be $1.3 trillion. It has not been paid. So the wealthy nations have to live up to their bargains. But also we Africans can't wait on them to live up to their own challenge, because governments I disagree that government is cash strapped, because everyday people are really paying taxes and are trying doing their best. So I'm not into raising taxes, but we could do some easy things in Africa. We cut down waste. And we cut down waste, we really have a real strong attitude towards wasteful government spending and turn that around. But also we need to create that enabling environment that gives young Africans, African entrepreneurs, African business to really push things up. Because when you do that, you know what happened? We start creating this oasis of hope across the continent. And these oasis of hope, because now you're having, boot camps with entrepreneurs going across the continent. Those guys are going to drive up new innovation, jobs, opportunities. They're doing business. We have 1.4 billion people in this continent. That's a huge market that everybody is looking at. Europe is 300 million people. So in 20 years, you're going to be 2 billion people in this continent. What are we have to look at that power. And most of that power is going to come around young people. So we invest in that future. Channel policies. Government has to do the right policies and get out of the way and let these young people drive it with innovation. But the transition is going to cost trillions of dollars, and we must be very careful. Nobody is going to give you aid to transition. The promises of the past has not worked. $800 billion in aid money spent in Africa. Where are we? It has actually taken us back. So we have to say, build business, everyday people running small businesses, getting into big businesses within the continent, creating jobs, and then you really see a spiral of things. Government now get increased revenue, and with cutting wasteful government spending and accountability, we're doing the right thing. So we have to look inward within Africa and really think, I like movies, but I was watching Wakanda Forever, but Wakanda Forever is a good movie, but the Black Panther is not coming. We're gonna have to do this ourselves.
I also want to speak about the transition. Let's talk about coal, oil, gas, and what's being called dirty, energy at this point. This narrative and what it means for the actions that we're taking. And a big thing that comes to mind is what we do when we go to COP, for instance. We try to reiterate our commitments, and then we try to get funding, which is not, I'm not saying is a bad thing at all, NJ. But of course, there's a model there that I think is flawed deeply, with us, going and presenting these plans and maybe even rushing ourselves to get clean at a pace that we possibly can't afford because we're still deeply in development mode.
A rush to renewables is going to destroy Africa. We have seen that with South Africa. The Just Energy Transition Plan South Africa negotiated was a big mistake. It is killing the economy right now. Because right now, South Africa's most cheaper, affordable, abundant energy in South Africa today is coal. So you shut down coal mines, you decommissioning coal mines, and what are the same wealthy nations? You're being paid to be poor. And we just have to get down to the basics and stop all this big language. Second thing, what is happening to coal towns? There is no plan on those coal towns. But at the same time, I was at COP on December 13. We had an agreement broke out. But what happened 6 days later? On December 19th, the same European nations that had forced us to say we're going to phase out or let go of fossil fuels, they signed the biggest fossil fuel deal, $50 billion between Norway and Germany for gas development. So 6 days ago, you were taking all these pledges. 6 days later, you signed the biggest deal. So you want me to transition and leave my resources in the ground so I don't have a fighting chance. Norway discovered oil in 1959. Today, at that time, it was just a country of fishermen, very poor. Today, it has a $2.3 trillion sovereign wealth fund and is the envy of the world. I think African nations can do the same because we cannot rush into a transition at their timeline that it affects us. The wealthy nations need to decarbonize. African nations need to industrialize. If you produce all Africa's gas today Our greenhouse gas emissions go up by less than 1%, 0.65%. So we don't even affect the climate crisis. We don't even have any dent in the change. But what happens if you produce that gas? You are going to ramp up industrialization so bad. And I explain it this way. Russia, 30 years ago, when the Cold War ended, Russia was importing 70% of its food. Russia took their natural gas, turned it around, and what's Russia producing today? Russia stopped importing food. It's exporting 30% of the world's food because they use natural gas. They built urea, ammonia, NPK fertilizer plants. They powered agriculture, gave jobs to Russians in agriculture, and now they're feeding. So most people in Africa realize that only because when you had the crisis in Ukraine, which is still ongoing, then like, oh, all of our grain, our wheat, and everything coming out of Russia. We can do that in Africa. South Africa today is stuck with environmentalists not letting anybody do anything in South Africa. Yesterday, there was an oil find in Namibia. Namibia has seen a big boom around the Orange Basin with a lot of oil and gas discoveries that nation is going to be transformed within 10 years so much. It's going to see one of the largest or the fastest growing economies. But 80% of that is in South Africa, and you can't even touch it. So why are you receiving aid to keep it in the ground? It makes no sense.
NJ, I want us to speak about, as we speak about transitioning, greenwashing on the African continent, which I think will be a huge temptation, specifically where there's aid, and we've spoken about aid, but where there's aid, there is always temptation then for things like greenwashing to take place, because that's how aid also works in terms of its own benefits from those who provide aid. And so I'm wondering about that, carbon credits, those kinds of markets as they emerge. Are these real markets? Are these real transformational markets, or is there a risk there?
There is a big risk. I mean, look at a country like Gabon. Gabon pride himself of going so much into the environment and they've done well with the forest and everything. But guess what? I was having a conversation with the former Gabon Minister of Energy. They have not seen a dollar. But then somebody else is selling their carbon credits and making money. And most African nations have not been very sophisticated on how to do that. So, and I'll give you an example. $600 billion of green bonds went out last year. Less than 2% came to the African continent. That is a problem. So we're being used because all you have to do is you get a foreign entrepreneur from Europe or from America, come to Africa, set up something, and then the next thing is that you're being able to access DFI funding and everything at the expense of African countries. And that's why you start seeing people talking about we're going to do crypto mining and all of that. And we need to be very, very careful about that. Of course, there are great possibilities to really have green projects go around. I'm a big fan of mini grids. Just do mini grids with solar in small rural towns so that there can be some form of electricity there, but we still have to deal with the base load energy that is needed, because if you're going to develop anything, you cannot develop any kind of economy with intermittent energy. But also, corporations have not really lived up to the bargain when it comes in there. So there's a lot of greenwashing. And the problem that has come with that is there has been very less pragmatism and common sense. So people are being pushed on a rush, so they cannot even meet it. So now they have to color everything to say we're green. So all you have to do, if you're a big polluter, for example, you just have to wear something green or you paint your coal mine green, and you say we're green. But that's not it. We are going more on symbolisms rather than substance. And I think Africa at this stage really needs to deal with the substance, the depth that is needed. If you are going to come back and say, okay, we invested. I'll give you a good example. The green hydrogen projects in Namibia or South Africa. It has been heralded to have great potential, but everything of that is destined for Europe because we don't have a hydrogen market in Africa. So what's the difference? We're looking at critical minerals from South Africa, Zimbabwe, and across Africa is destined for wealthy countries. So what are we talking about? So are we replacing one form of exploitative energy to another form of more exploitative energy? What about the children working in these mines? We just have to give them a green jacket and say they're okay. But then we have to also deal with, I keep saying, build that supply chain across Africa. You can have hubs in North, South, from Cape to Cairo, and really build that and be focused and intentional about it. But there's been, I lament the fact that there's a lot of talk and less action, and more symbols and less substance.
NJ, of course, you work with the Africa Energy Chamber. Let's talk about how cohesive this conversation is across the continent. Are we speaking the same language? Are we singing out of the same hymn book? Ideologically, are we agreeing that there's a certain direction we need to take? Because, of course, if we agree on the fundamentals, then we can start moving in the same direction.
I'll get you in trouble now. The biggest problem with Africa and its energy transition and its energy dialogue and its energy future is with African elites. African elites have actually failed Africa when it comes to these discussions because there is a certain feeling that I want to be accepted to wear a bow tie and sit at Oxford and sit in London, and I want to go to Davos so they can like me there and they say I'm the good African, I'm the good Negro. And I think we need to get away from that. And I think that basically tells you that there's something missing with you. You're not proud of who you are. And so you want to speak this language and speak the Queen or the King's English so well so that you can be accepted. I don't want to be accepted. I want to be respected as an African. And I think that's more important. The everyday Africans, and I talk as a capitalist, would pay a lot of money to get energy. And if you don't believe me, look at what happened with the cell phones. Everyday Africans are going out there, they're paying for data so they can connect with their social media and they can live their lives. We can do the same with energy. But also these discussions, and I've seen it at COP and many places, we don't think much about the kid in Mozambique without electricity, the kid in Accra, Ghana, without any chance to get a job. We are more focused about how they see us. And so, but there is a big difference. The European or the wealthy countries, they are focused on their people. That's why, in spite of all these climate discussions, they would come to South Africa and take your A-grade coal and take it over there to power their people because they know it's important for their people to have power. But we have really accepted that it's okay to be poor. I reject that notion that we have to accept that it's okay to be poor, it's okay to not have electricity. It should be a crisis to think that 600 million people don't have any kind of electricity. And where are the elite Africans, me included, because I'll be honest, I'm privileged. I sit in these rooms and I say it every day. And yes, I came from a very poor background, but I am drinking in wells that I never drilled. I'm sitting on tables that my parents didn't have a chance. But so we have an obligation to step up. But I think that it's not everyday people with these discussions. They are the victims of our inaction. And we that have access to Paris, Africa, US, Africa, Italy, Africa. I mean, they just went to Africa, to Italy right now. All African leaders, 48 countries showed up to Italy. And the Italian Prime Minister gives me a pledge of $5 billion. Really? You think we can't find $5 billion in Africa? That all the heads of state, the countries have to stop working for a week and go to Italy for them to divide $5 billion to 48 countries. You just, I'm a bad math student, but if I spread that out, that's like, it's nothing. It's nothing. So I think African elites have really failed. I wouldn't say African presidents. No, most of the elites, you go into the COP discussions, you find Africans at COP advocating against African interests with green stuff, and I'm sitting there with even my European, American counterparts, they're looking at me like, what's wrong with your people? And that is what is sad today in these discussions when it comes to energy.
On the other side of African elites is African youth. And of course, this population grows at an exponential rate. And we are expecting that in a few years' time, I think 1 in 3 people on the continent will be young, NJ. We know that we need electricity for them, but I'm wondering if there's a role for young people to really play in generation, in transmission, in distribution of energy, before we see this youth dividend that is supposed to play itself out.
Well, they have the most amazing opportunity today to make billions of dollars, millions of dollars, and really do that change. I mean, I put it this way. This continent was freed by the Kwame Nkrumahs of the world, or Tambo Mandela, Julius Nyerere, Lumumba. Most of the time in the 60s, those guys were in their 20s and early 30s. But they showed transformational leadership across Africa that freed the continent. They didn't have no email, they didn't have no cell phones, they didn't have TikTok or Instagram or WhatsApp, but they figured out how to liberate their people. So here we are in 2024 with African youth, emails, TikTok, Instagram, 2 black cards, education, everything. But they can't get to meet together. They sit on a dinner table and everybody on their cell phone. How are you going to get a business meeting done with that? So that attention deficit that we have or with young people, they may also need to have a discussion with themselves on how they have to change that. And you can really change that because today you can connect with somebody in China in a minute. You can connect with somebody in Belgium in a minute, and you're able to still do business. So you can do intra-Africa trade, but you can also do trade with someone from Canada or from Brazil and really drive that forward. But there's so much amazing opportunities that young people have to look at. Just imagine, we're talking about the electricity shortage in the continent. Imagine you just say, my business is going to be about providing lights, and I set up solar mini grids in small communities. You're going to make a lot of money because you're bringing light into that community. You're going to drive up business. And by bringing in electricity, you will be able to trade different things and you build your own companies. Fintechs. How do you use fintech today to connect electricity and make sure that you can get fast payments of electricity? So there's just so much. And we have really brilliant young people who are doing that. The real issue is that they have to speak up, they have to drive it, and they have to also push leadership to give them those incentives. There's no reason why we cannot pass tax incentives today for young people in energy to create more business. They sometimes face insurmountable odds to compete, because if you're a young person from Europe coming to Africa, you get a tax incentive, you call yourself an investor. If you're an African in that country, you don't get a break, you get a big tax bill. But now that guy coming in from Europe, so in some countries already have 10% tax holiday. But now the citizens are not having any kind of those incentives. But when the holiday is over, they go. But the citizens stay. Empower your citizens, incentivize growth. You cannot legislate growth, you incentivize growth, and incentivize it with our young people by giving them those tax breaks and cutting down some of the regulatory bottleneck with them to start businesses, incentivizing them to come together. But also, among young people, you don't have to have it all by yourself. Everybody don't have to be the CEO, everybody don't have to be the chairman, everybody don't have to be the founder. Get together, form it, work together, and grow it together. You cannot build everything by yourself.
When we also speak about development on the African continent, NJ, we often speak about lagging behind, and you said this issue of controlling our narrative. Of course, we're behind if we must face facts here, but to accelerate ourselves, we might be able to embrace technology. I'm wondering where energy and technology, collide, and what that can do for the African continent.
It is what is really going to drive the continent in the future, because the energy systems of the world, you are using more technology to drive everything than actually people. And that's why I talked earlier about fintechs. We look at how we bring these technologies, we can do it better, and we can drive it. But there's also something, and that missing angle that we don't see. Women, they are going to drive the energy systems more than anything. If you ignore 52 to 55% of the African population in this transition, in energy growth, then you're destined to fail. Because I work in oil and gas, women are still the last hired and the first fired. And we just have to admit that the numbers that we're seeing are less than 10%. But also, this is where we need to start looking at those changes. As we incentivize technologies, how are we incentivizing women in the energy workforce? And we have to deal with those issues that we don't want to talk about. Sexual harassment among energy companies, it's there. It's the elephant in the room. Walking into those halls as a woman and you having people make fun about your looks, how you look today, men don't get that. Going in oil rig, or sometimes going in some buildings and there's a male-only toilets and women or rooms, you don't see that. So we need to have a conscious effort to deal with that and really say, this is time when policies should make change that really incentivize that. Unless we start doing that, we're missing that. Technology is going to drive that. It's going to really be able to see how we turn these energy systems around and really improve it. I'll give you an example. There's a young Nigerian I met when I visited Nigeria. He has basically been able to use technologies to connect what he called virtual pipelines. And these virtual pipelines are delivering natural gas across Nigeria without you having to use heavy metal and all of that, and he's moving forward with that. That can be replicated across the continent. You can have virtual pipelines to deliver solar systems across that. Now you're talking about using drones to deliver solar panels in remote areas and even work on installations. Young Africans should be engaged in that and really driving that. That will be a key part of really driving that, because we have a continent that is it's massive by land, and it's also a rural population that really needs things. But our cities are getting packed. Don't forget, most African cities were not meant for many millions when they were planned. But today, because of poverty, there's an urban crisis. So the only way you're going to be able to provide cities that are packed and really, really rushed is to find ways to use technology to really drive and improve lives of people there. And technology works very well with energy, especially with payments.
And Jay, before I let you go, I must ask you, is it possible that Africa could fumble the era that we find ourselves in, that we could make decisions that in 20, 30 years' time, when we reflect, we would realize that we had all of this opportunity, didn't use it as we should. The continent is still referred to as dark, and we still maybe consider ourselves as a dark continent.
I think we can fumble, but we can change that now. And it starts with having an African Union that 80% of its funding is not done by aid. So you can make decisions. They built a building, it's the African Union, and the Chinese bought the whole thing because the Chinese give it to them as a gift. The Western countries are funding the African Union. So do you really have an African Union? And that African Union has to sit and get research. You see, there's something you see with corporations that they do very well, R&D. That's the engine of every corporation, because you cannot go produce without having the right kind of research and development. Our research and development is handed to us. So we are not able to really process data, think through things. It's like you can't use ChatGPT to go through an energy transition. It doesn't work. So we would have to fund our own African Union, our own African institutions. We would have to really start finding ways to really get homegrown technologies. The Chinese have done it, so don't say it's not possible. So you having that your own R&D, and that would shape decision-making process. The African Development Bank was going to hire somebody to do a complete study on an African energy transition. You know what we did? It's a fine man. We hired Jeffrey Sachs out of New York, where at the same time when you had a bid with brilliant African professors from Ghana, Nigeria, Zambia, that understand the continent, work within the continent, they understand that you could use them. These same African professors had gone to Harvard and Columbia and Oxford, so they do speak the Queen's language as well, but we prefer to have somebody else that would do a fly-by-night strategy from New York. It doesn't work. You have to do, we have to do, in order not to fumble, we have to start with policies, processes that we think has to be people-centric at heart. And that's what you do, unless you connect it to that young girl in Beira who is not having any hope, and you put their lives and everything you do in those big rooms, and you put them on the table, then that's how we don't fumble. We have a chance not to fumble, because I come from a tradition where one of my greatest heroes, Martin King Jr., says the arc of moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. True, but it doesn't bend by itself. It is what we do today that we can shape it, and we continue bending it towards the right place, because you got to work on it. You have to develop it, and at a certain stage, just take 30% of what you get out of coal, oil, natural gas, invest it in funds within Africa, and then drive your own. Look at the chokehold on finance that we have today. You're talking about fumbling? They've cut off financing on coal, oil, natural gas. But what did the European Union do? The European Union 2 years ago defined natural gas as green energy. So they fund it. But green energy for them, not green energy for Africans. So why are we taking all our sovereign wealth funds, all African sovereign wealth funds, you're putting it in Europe for them to fund natural gas in Europe, and those funds are not funding natural gas in Africa? Why don't you have an African energy bank? Why don't you use our sovereign wealth funds to fund African hedge funds and create financial instruments within the continent to really drive up? That's how you don't fumble, because if all your money is with the guy that wants to block you, then you're financing yourself to the being called the dark continent.
Well, NJ, it's been a pleasure catching up with you. Thank you so much for
joining. Thank you, Tanana. Thank you for putting up with me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Let's Talk Development, brought to you by Amila Africa Insights, as well as Art House out in Tagari. Visit mmarthouse.co.za to read more about this fantastic space that we've used today, and do stay tuned for our next episode.